After my mom's gold-digging boyfriend wanted me out, she kicked me out too. Now she wants back in my life after years of silence and no apology. I'm a 25-year-old woman, and I haven't spoken to my mom in the past 5 years. Our estrangement began when I was 20, and she unexpectedly asked me to leave our home. The reason? She wanted to make room for her new boyfriend. This man, let's call him Rick, was quite transparently a gold digger, and he made no effort to hide his intentions. Mom met Rick about 6 months before she introduced him into our lives, but curiously, she never mentioned to him that she had a daughter. My mom is now 50, but back then, she was nearing 45, even though she liked to convince everyone she was barely 40. It was a transparent lie, but she succeeded in maintaining the facade with a fair amount of fillers and Botox treatments. Determining Rick's exact age was trickier, but I estimated he was in his early to mid-30s. He was reasonably attractive, with stylish clothes and a charming smile, and my mom has always been good-looking for her age. Initially, I thought they seemed well-suited for each other. That perception changed quickly once Rick started conversing. He couldn't stop raving about how extraordinary it was that Mom was so financially secure. He claimed he admired her for being a strong, independent, wealthy woman, which he insisted was why he wanted to be with her. However, his gaze lingered just a bit too long on the opulent furniture and pricey decor of our expansive home. No doubt, those were the true reasons for his interest in my mom. It's well known in our social circles that my mom's wealth is solely derived from an inheritance. Her parents left her a considerable fortune, making her an heiress, and that essentially constitutes her entire backstory. She never pursued a career or built anything on her own, so while the wealthy part was true, describing her as strong or independent felt misleading. She had never worked a single day in her life. My grandparents were the real architects, having started a company from scratch, creating the fortune she enjoyed. When they passed away, the reins of the company were handed to her uncle, who's been managing it successfully ever since. My mom never expressed any interest in overseeing the business or understanding its operations. As long as she received her share of the profits, she was content. This lack of ambition or desire to engage with the family legacy puzzled me, but it also explained why she might find someone like Rick appealing, someone who admired her for what she had, rather than who she was. For Rick, it seemed like Mom's lifestyle and money were all that mattered. And sadly, she seemed fine with that, often basking in the admiration of her social circle while neglecting the more profound aspects of life, like family. My mom has always floated between different hobbies without ever committing to anything long enough to turn it into a real career. She dabbled in painting, tried her hand at pottery, and even took a course in creative writing, but none of these pursuits lasted more than a few months. Motherhood was no exception. I believe she saw having a child as something to fill her time, akin to her other short-lived interests. I'm convinced that if she hadn't been bored, I wouldn't have been born. She likely would have ended the pregnancy if she'd felt differently at the time. Ironically, her impulsiveness and lack of direction are what led to my existence, serving as yet another example of her inability to see things through. Thankfully, my grandparents were far more caring and responsible than she was. They had a warmth and steadiness about them that was comforting, like a favorite blanket you curl up with on a cold winter's night. When she lost interest in being a parent, they stepped in to raise me, filling in the gaps her absence created. My mom mostly left me with them, preferring to spend her days out partying or socializing with her eclectic group of friends who seemed to share her penchant for fleeting pleasures. Growing up, I genuinely believed my grandparents were my actual parents. They were the ones always there for me, giving me love and stability. They taught me values, helped me with my school projects, and were there for every important milestone in my life. As for my father, I've never known him, as he was a one-night stand and she didn't stay in touch, so I never had the chance to know who he was. My grandparents, however, gave me all the support and love I could have asked for, making sure I never felt the void left by my absent parents. My dad was a mystery, and my mother was more like a distant relative than a parent. My grandparents were my true family, and for a long time, that was enough for me. They filled my days with stories of their own childhoods and taught me how to ride a bike, cook simple meals, and how to be kind to others. Things changed when my grandma passed away during my junior year. Losing her was devastating, akin to losing a guiding star in a vast ocean. A couple of years later, my grandfather followed, leaving an even bigger emptiness in my heart. Losing them felt like losing the only people who had ever genuinely cared about me. I remember feeling adrift, like a ship without an anchor, unsure of what to do next. I still had my uncle, who offered some support. Though we weren't as close as I was with my grandparents, he assured me that he'd be there for me, and he kept that promise. I didn't actually live with my grandparents full time. Instead, I'd go to their house every weekend as I lived with my mom, but even at home, she was hardly ever around. So I spent most afternoons and evenings alone, doing homework or just relaxing. I didn't mind since it gave me freedom, and I got to see my grandparents on weekends. My time with them was precious, a sanctuary from the otherwise empty house I lived in. After they passed, I went off to college but came home at least once a month and for holidays. Coming back wasn't really about reconnecting with my mom. It was more about finding comfort in my childhood home. Being around my mother was just something I tolerated on these visits. She hadn't changed a bit. She remained the same self-absorbed, superficial person she'd always been. Her life was filled with appearances and social gatherings, and I never felt that she had any real depth or concern beyond herself. Her priorities were clear, and so was my place in her life, a distant second to everything else she valued. Yet, in those brief moments of being back home, surrounded by the familiar sights and smells of my childhood, I found a sense of peace and continuity, despite everything. My mom had been through numerous relationships, but none ever lasted. Often, her boyfriends couldn't handle her active social life. She was always out with friends and sometimes other men, which made some of them jealous. She loved going to dinners, attending parties, and enjoying weekends away, all of which didn't sit well with those who expected her to be more available. Other times, she simply grew tired of them and moved on without much thought for their feelings, as if they were mere episodes in the series of her life. I'd met a few of her boyfriends, and whenever they broke up, I could hear every argument from my room above the living room. The walls were thin, and every raised voice or slammed door became a familiar sound. Not once did she ever fight to keep anyone in her life, which told me she didn't care deeply for any of them. It was as if she held her heart at a distance, never allowing anyone to settle in fully. I wanted to warn her, to tell her I suspected he was just using her. But our relationship wasn't the kind where I could speak freely about such things. Besides, I'd always assumed she could handle her relationships, and I didn't want to interfere. I hesitated to say anything, hoping Rick might prove me wrong, though deep down I doubted it. Unfortunately, this choice would later come back to haunt us both. But when she started dating Rick, things took a surprising turn. I usually thought my mom had a keen sense for people, able to read them like open books, but with him, she missed all the signs. Rick was different. He was a clear opportunist, though my mom seemed oblivious. She'd been dating him for about 3 months when she first brought him home, and I happened to be there that weekend. It was a rare occasion for me to visit, and I wasn't expecting to meet anyone. When Rick saw me and I politely greeted him, he looked startled. It became obvious that my mom hadn't mentioned she had a daughter, which threw him off for a second. He recovered quickly, putting on a charming smile, but I could tell something wasn't right. His handshake was too firm, his eye contact too steady, as if he were trying to convince me of something. I could see through him right away. He wasn't interested in my mom. He was after her wealth. Throughout dinner, he kept talking about how incredible it was that he'd won over such a beautiful, independent woman. He praised her achievements, her resilience, her stunning appearance, all while casting calculating glances around our home. His compliments were dripping with flattery, and my mom seemed charmed by it, her laughter ringing out as she basked in his attention. He especially focused on her wealth, which seemed to be his main attraction. He couldn't have made his intentions more obvious if he tried, but my mom was eating it up. The way she smiled at him, you'd think he hung the stars in the sky just for her. After dinner, my mom revealed that she'd invited Rick to stay with us for a couple of weeks. He'd recently lost his job and was facing eviction, so he needed a place to stay temporarily. Everything clicked for me then. His excessive compliments and charm were just a way to secure a place to crash. My mom had unknowingly become his safety net. As I looked at them sitting together on the couch, comfortable and cozy, I worried about how she might react when the truth came out. Would she see through him eventually, or would she remain blind to his manipulations? The thought of her being hurt was difficult to bear, and I resolved to keep a closer eye on Rick while he was around. A few weeks passed, and I didn't return home until the following month. During that time, my mom and I didn't stay in touch, so I wasn't aware of how things were going with her and Rick. We used to chat occasionally, but recently our conversations had dwindled to almost nothing. When I came back home, I quickly realized that Rick had essentially moved in. The house, which used to be filled with my mother's personal touches, had become his domain, and he'd transformed it into a typical bachelor pad. The subtle elegance she once cherished had been replaced with sports memorabilia and mismatched furniture. What was even more surprising was that my mom didn't seem to mind at all. The place was a complete mess, with clothes strewn about and dishes piled high in the sink. But she casually reassured me that the housekeeper would take care of it by the morning. This was unexpected because my mom had always been a stickler for cleanliness and order, so seeing her tolerate the chaos was odd. She'd always prided herself on her immaculate home, where everything was in its rightful place. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself. Once again, I didn't feel like it was my place to say anything. Over the weekend, Rick and I barely interacted, and I stayed mostly in my room, just like I did on every other visit home. My room had become my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the tension in the rest of the house. I'd return only for a couple of days, and I preferred to stay out of everyone's way. I didn't have any interest in socializing, so I made sure to avoid any unnecessary conversations. The only time I left my room was for meals, grabbing my food quickly to retreat back to my sanctuary to eat in peace. It was my safe haven amidst the unpredictability of the household dynamic. Let me emphasize that during the entire weekend, I didn't have a single conversation with Rick, but for some inexplicable reason, he still seemed to have a problem with my presence. On the day I was supposed to leave, my mom came into my room to talk. That in itself was strange because usually there was nothing for us to discuss. When she said it was important, I knew something was off. Her tone was serious, and she avoided eye contact, which was unlike her, and sure enough, it was bad news. She told me that she would appreciate it if I didn't return home after that month because apparently Rick wasn't comfortable with me being there. He had said that he wanted it to be just the two of them, and my presence was ruining the vibe. According to him, he and my mom had found a rhythm, a routine that suited their new lifestyle, and I had disrupted it by coming home unexpectedly. He didn't feel like he was in a bachelor's environment anymore and was apparently uncomfortable with the idea of it feeling like a family. He wasn't ready for that level of commitment, preferring the freedom and lack of responsibility that came with his bachelor lifestyle. The whole situation made me realize how much had changed in my absence and how my place in my own home had become so uncertain. I could immediately tell that Rick was just making up excuses. His body language and the way he avoided eye contact made it clear he didn't want me around. He was grasping at straws to justify it, concocting reasons that didn't hold up. It was beyond insulting, especially since this was my home first, the place I grew up and felt most comfortable. If anything, he was the one ruining the vibe, not me. In a moment of frustration, I decided to confront my mom and ask her when Rick would be leaving, as he was only supposed to stay temporarily. She had reassured me earlier that he was just going to live here for a couple of weeks until he found another job and got back on his feet. But it seemed like weeks had turned into months with no end in sight. Unfortunately, I said the wrong thing, and my mother immediately became defensive. Her tone shifted, and she snapped, telling me it was none of my business and that I needed to respect her decisions. It was like a wall went up between us. According to her, it was her house, and I was an adult now who needed to find his own path. She made it clear that I needed to leave and stay out of the situation because she was serious about Rick, and whatever he said, she would do. It felt like she was choosing him over me, and that stung deeply. If he wanted me gone, she would make sure I was gone. At that point, I realized arguing would be futile, so I didn't try to fight it. However, I couldn't keep my thoughts to myself, so I told her that Rick was just using her for her money and that one day she would regret choosing him over me. My words didn't seem to make a dent. She didn't seem to care about what I said. Honestly, at that moment, neither did I. So without any further discussion, I packed my things and left that day, my heart heavy with disappointment and sadness. For the next few months leading up to Christmas, I stayed away from home. I tried to focus on my studies and keep myself busy to avoid thinking about the situation. It was clear that my house was no longer my home, and I had no intention of going back. But as Christmas approached and winter break began, I found myself in a difficult position. The campus dorms were closing, and students were required to leave, so I had nowhere to go. I felt a mix of anxiety and dread about my uncertain future. After some hesitation, I decided to reach out to my uncle for help. We weren't particularly close, but we had kept in touch over the years. He was my mother's younger brother, a kind and understanding man with a family of his own. I wasn't sure how to ask him for a favor. It felt awkward and uncomfortable. Still, I had no other choice. My grandparents had set up a college fund for me, so financially, I was secure, but they hadn't prepared for a situation like this. I felt a sense of relief and gratitude when I called my uncle. He didn't hesitate to offer me a place to stay with him and his family for as long as I needed. I was deeply grateful, and I will always be thankful to him for opening his home to me. He made me feel welcome and treated me like I was part of the family, providing me a sense of belonging and comfort during a challenging time. During that time, we talked more than we ever had before, and I learned that the reason he hadn't tried to form a closer relationship with me earlier was because of my mother. The two of them had always had a strained relationship growing up, filled with disagreements and misunderstandings, and he felt uncomfortable trying to reach out to me, fearing it might upset her. He had wanted to stay out of the drama, so as long as I was taken care of, he kept his distance. But now that my mother had kicked me out, he felt it was time to step in and offer the support I desperately needed. My daughter was born just a few months ago, and the love I have for her is indescribable. She has brought so much joy into my life, and everything feels better with her in it. And yet I made the mistake of sharing the news on social media. I kept my pregnancy very private, only telling John, my uncle, and a handful of close friends. I've never been very active on social media, partly because I believe in the concept of the evil eye, but after giving birth, I just couldn't resist. I felt an overwhelming urge to share our happiness with the world. He couldn't let me be homeless, and after our heartfelt conversation, he became the only family I could rely on. His wife was the kindest woman I'd ever met after my grandmother, always welcoming me with open arms and a warm smile, and their kids quickly became like the siblings I never had, sharing laughter and creating memories together. From that Christmas on, I spent a lot of time with my uncle's family, and it felt like I finally had a place where I belonged, a sense of belonging that I had missed for so long. After graduating from college, I needed a place to stay while I searched for a job and became financially independent. That's when I learned that my mother and Rick had broken up not long after I left. I didn't know all the details, but word was that Rick had been cheating on her with another woman, a betrayal that seemed to shatter the life she had envisioned. It was bitterly ironic. She had kicked me out to start a new life with him, but in the end, everything she had sacrificed was for nothing, leaving her alone with the consequences of her choices. Over time, however, my mother, being the narcissistic and self-centered person she is, never reached out to apologize after her breakup with Rick. Honestly, I was glad she didn't. I had nothing left to say to her, and after everything, we were done. My uncle and his family had become my true support system, offering me love and stability when I needed it most. I never really needed my mother when my grandparents were still around, as their kindness and guidance filled that void, and with my uncle now in my life, I didn't feel the need for her at all. Years have passed since that fallout, and a lot has changed for me. I've built a life without her. I'm married now and have a child of my own. 2 years ago, I met my husband, John, at a job I took shortly after graduating. It wasn't supposed to be anything long-term. It was just a stepping stone on my career path, and I never expected it to lead to a serious relationship. But here we are, 2 years later, with a beautiful daughter who lights up our lives every day, reminding me that family can be found in the most unexpected places. That turned out to be a huge mistake, as that's how my mother found out I was pregnant and had already given birth to my little girl. After years of silence, she reached out to me unexpectedly. It happened just last week, and honestly, I didn't know how to feel about it at first. She sent me a long, heartfelt email explaining that some family members had informed her about the baby. She expressed how desperate she was to meet her granddaughter, whom she hadn't even known about until recently. The email also infuriated me. Not once did she acknowledge the need to apologize for her actions. She wrote an entire page about how miserable she was, but completely ignored the fact that she had abandoned me without a second thought. Yes, I was fortunate to have loving grandparents and an uncle who stepped in to help, but that didn't replace the bond a mother should have with her child. The first thing I did was look for an apology in the email, but unsurprisingly, there was none. It was completely in line with her usual behavior, never acknowledging any wrongdoing. She spent the majority of the email going on about how difficult life had been for her after her breakup with Rick and how she still had deep-seated trust issues stemming from that toxic relationship. She lamented the profound loneliness she felt, especially since all of her old friends now had families of their own, and even those without families were caught up in their own busy lives. She mentioned how challenging it had been for her to adjust to being alone in her house, especially at her age, when companionship seemed more important than ever. She complained about how she hadn't had any family to talk to since I left, and how her friends were all too occupied with their own lives to lend her an ear. She even went so far as to say that she wanted to fix things with me, hoping we could reconnect and rebuild whatever relationship was left. She expressed how tired she was of spending every day alone in her quiet house and how, as she got older, she couldn't continue like this. She needed me to welcome her back into my life and back into our family unit. I wasn't sure how to respond, but I knew one thing. It wasn't going to be easy for me to let her back in after all these years. Reading that email, although it was undeniably sad, didn't stir any sympathy in me. I had already made my peace with the fact that she was no longer my mother a long time ago. The exact moment she chose her boyfriend over me, yes, it was upsetting to think about her feeling lonely and sad, like a character in one of those tragic novels, but I wasn't responsible for making her feel like she was still a part of my life or family. She had 25 years to show me that I mattered to her, to make me feel like I was truly her daughter, but she didn't. Her own life always seemed to take priority over mine, and now I had my own life to focus on with my new family. She never treated me as a daughter, always acting more like a distant relative, so I wasn't obligated to treat her like a mother. It was as simple as that. Growing up, I often wondered why I wasn't good enough for her. I tried everything I could think of to make her love me and accept me, spending countless nights lying awake, devising plans to win her affection. But it wasn't until I reached middle school with more life experience under my belt that I realized the problem wasn't me. It was her. Yet those lost years were gone, forever etched in my memory, and I couldn't help but ask myself why she even had me if she wasn't interested in being my mother. I would never get those years back, and the absence of her love left a permanent mark on me. I sent that angry email without holding anything back, and unsurprisingly, my mom was hurt and upset. Within hours, she responded, and exactly as I anticipated, she said that if I was truly that angry, I shouldn't have bothered replying at all. She told me that I should have simply ignored her attempt to reach out. Instead, I had chosen to tear into her, saying things I knew would hurt her. The lack of an apology for all of that was painful, a wound that never quite healed, but what truly struck me was how she couldn't even muster the decency to apologize for kicking me out of her life when I needed her most. She knew it would be hard for me, especially since my uncle and I weren't close at the time and my grandparents, who had been my pillars of support, had passed away. But none of that seemed to matter to her. All she cared about was her own happiness, her life with Rick, and whatever made her feel good in the moment, completely oblivious to the chaos she left in her wake. After reading that email, all the anger and frustration I had bottled up over the years suddenly surged to the surface. I didn't just ignore her message. I decided to respond, and in the most unfiltered way possible. And let me tell you, it wasn't a polite or composed response. I unleashed everything I had been holding back, years of repressed emotions spilling out uncontrollably. I called her names that no mother should ever be called and told her she didn't even deserve to be part of society, let alone be a mother. I even went as far as saying I would have preferred to have been an orphan than be born to someone like her, someone who had no respect for herself or for anyone else. I told her that Rick was the perfect match for her because, just like her, he was shallow, selfish, and completely out of touch with reality. It was almost ironic that two people so alike in their narcissism hadn't stayed together, because honestly, they deserved each other. Their relationship was a reflection of everything they stood for, a partnership built on self-interest and disregard for others. I made it clear that I would never allow her to meet my family, a family I had built on love and trust, values I found elsewhere. While we might share blood, I had no connection with her and didn't want one. I made it clear that this was the way I wanted things to stay, a decision rooted in the need to protect myself and those I truly cared about. She acknowledged her mistakes as a mother, but claimed that reaching out after all these years was her way of trying to mend things between us, especially since she wanted to be involved in her granddaughter's life. She expressed a desire to connect and share experiences, perhaps trying to fill a void that had grown over the years. However, according to her, if I didn't want that, I could have just told her rather than going as far as I did with such hurtful words. Regardless, I've decided to move on and not let this drag me down any further. I'm genuinely not interested in her drama or trying to fix anything with her. The only person I need to focus on right now is my daughter. She's the one who truly needs me. I can't do that if I'm wasting my time fighting with my mother or trying to convince her she's wrong. It's pointless, and frankly, I have better things to do. So she can keep sending her angry emails, They all go straight to spam, and I don't even bother opening them or reading them anymore. Honestly, I do feel a little guilty for how harsh I was in my response. The language I used was far from kind. It was filled with anger and cursing, and I deeply regret sending it. I could tell by her message that she was genuinely upset, and I feel bad knowing how much that must have stung, especially considering her age and the loneliness she seems to be dealing with now. It wasn't easy for her to receive such an angry response after reaching out with an olive branch, and part of me feels like I owe her an apology. But at the same time, I don't want her to misunderstand my intentions or feel like she can just pick up where we left off. Update 1. Hey, thank you all for the kind messages. My daughter is doing great, and John and I have talked through everything. After giving it some thought, we both agree that I don't owe her an apology. Sure, I might have gone a bit too far, but what I said wasn't wrong. She had spent my whole life treating me like I wasn't important, like an afterthought. And now, because she's old and lonely, she suddenly wants to act like we're a family. She wants me to let her back in just because she has no one else. That's just not fair. And what bothers me even more is that she didn't even think to apologize first for the way she treated me all those years ago. So she can keep complaining all she wants, but it won't change the fact that she was a terrible mother, and I'm glad I cut ties with her. Honestly, I don't ever want to reconnect with her. Even when I lived with her, it always felt like I was living with a stranger, not my mother. It would just feel wrong to introduce her as my daughter's grandma. That's a title meant for someone who truly loves and cares for their family. And she never was and still isn't family to me. I also discussed the situation with my uncle and aunt, and they agreed with my stance. They told me I had no reason to feel guilty because my mother had essentially brought this on herself. She had been distant from her family for years. Not just from me, but from my uncle as well, and he thought that her actions were justified. Sure, maybe I went a bit too far with the email, but she shouldn't have expected anything less after reaching out to me 5 years after kicking me out of her house and then demanding to meet my daughter. The fact that she couldn't even offer a simple apology was something I couldn't just ignore. It was something I would never forget or forgive. I found some solace in their agreement, realizing I wasn't alone in feeling hurt and betrayed by her actions. Update 2. So, here's the latest twist in what seems like an endless string of family drama. I don't know why, but my mother thought it would be a good idea to show up at my house just 2 weeks after I made it abundantly clear that I didn't want any part of her drama anymore. I was home today because I'm on maternity leave, taking care of my newborn daughter, and John was at work as usual. It was a typical day, and I was going through my routine of feeding and changing the baby. When the doorbell rang, I didn't think twice about answering it. It was around the time John usually gets back from work, so I naturally assumed it was him. However, to my surprise and absolute dismay, it wasn't John on the other side of the door. It was my mother. I'm guessing she must have asked some relative of mine for my address, and like fools, they gave it to her without considering the consequences or even consulting me. When I saw it was her, a wave of frustration and disbelief washed over me. I gathered all the strength I could muster and immediately shut the door in her face. She was caught completely off guard because, naturally, she expected me to let her in after opening it. Most people would think it's rude to shut the door in someone's face, but at that moment, I wasn't concerned with being polite or diplomatic. I just wanted her gone, and I was ready to do whatever it took to make that happen. Then came the yelling. She started screaming at me from the other side of the door, completely losing it as if I was in the wrong here. I was already considering calling the police when she decided to escalate things further by picking up a rock and throwing it through my front window. She shattered the glass with a loud crash and immediately ran off, perhaps realizing the gravity of what she'd done. Luckily, my daughter was safely in her nursery, far away from the turmoil at the front door, and I was the only one near the door at that moment. Even though I was shaken by the incident, I was unharmed. The only thing that took the hit was my window, which now had a gaping hole and shards of glass scattered everywhere. I didn't hesitate for a second. I picked up my phone and called the police, determined to press charges against her. Now, I'm just waiting for the situation to calm down and for the authorities to handle the matter. She was furious, yelling at me about how ungrateful and unfair I was being. Honestly, though, I couldn't care less about her anger or accusations. What truly matters is that neither I nor my daughter were harmed. This was serious, and if anyone had been standing near that door, things could have ended much worse. So John and I made the decision to file for a restraining order against her. We know we need to act quickly to protect our family. We also reached out to inform my uncle about what happened so he could take the necessary precautions and secure his own home too, just in case she decides to make another unannounced visit. Update 3. Hey everyone, I've got an update to share with you. My mother was sentenced to 6 months of community service and was required to pay a hefty fine due to her actions. The court also ordered her to cover the damages she caused, and thankfully, we managed to recover quite a bit of money from her as compensation. To be honest, I think the only reason she avoided jail time was because of her connections and the high-powered lawyer she hired, who skillfully navigated the legal system on her behalf. But honestly, that's not our concern now. The important thing is that we got the money we were owed, and we've successfully secured the restraining orders, so we don't need to worry about her interfering in our lives anymore. On a more positive note, John and I had been considering moving to a bigger place for a while now, and after everything that's happened, we're more certain than ever that it's the right decision. It will be just me, John, and our little family starting fresh in a new home. A new chapter of our lives. We're excited about the future and the possibilities that come with it. Wish us luck, everyone, as we embark on this new journey.